Hello and welcome to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Muncer. As ever, I am your host. We're bringing you a little bonus episode today because this weekend sees the release of the new Leigh Whannell horror film, Wolfman. Obviously, Leigh Whannell directed a brilliant modernization of The Invisible Man back in 2019. This is his follow-up, and he's given a similar treatment to the classic werewolf movie from the 1940s. He's given it a fun, fresh, modern twist, and he's done something really interesting with it. So later on in the episode, I'll be joined by Chris Hewitt, and we'll be discussing the movie in spoilerific detail. But first of all, here is my interview with Leigh Whannell. This interview is completely spoiler-free. I got to chat to him for about 20 minutes. Now, it was a bit of a chaotic day. This was the day that the fires broke out in LA. Leigh Whannell lives in LA, so he was talking to me remotely from his house, and bless him, there was a lot going on. Basically, there were fires all over LA around his house, so he wasn't quite sure what was going to happen that day, whether he was going to be evacuated. It was really kind of him to still agree to do the interview anyway, but he was a little bit distracted. He also had no power in his house. He had no Wi-Fi, so he was talking to me via his phone using his 5G, so apologies if the signal comes and goes a little bit. There was a lot going on for poor Leigh Whannell, but we still had a really lovely conversation. Leigh Whannell is such a lovely guy. I sat and chatted to him about making the movie, about the history of werewolf films in general, and about his inspirations behind this particular version of The Wolfman. So please enjoy my conversation with the brilliant Leigh Whannell. Leigh Whannell, hello. How are you doing?
Oh, thanks for having me. It's surreal.
Yeah, it's a bit of a surreal day. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here to chat to me today. I'm a big fan of Wolfman. Tell us a little bit about how this project came to be. You know, it's been 5 years since your last film, Invisible Man, which for so many of us was basically the last film we saw on the big screen pre-COVID, right? Tell us about how you got to this point, a movie that feels very much post-COVID.
Yeah, I mean, it was a strange time, obviously, for everybody.
Yeah.
Like COVID, I feel like after Invisible Man came out, the world broke. I mean, for everybody, and I'm not sure what it was like for you in the UK, but it was a very discombobulating time. And I had 3 young kids, and everything just felt off its axis. And I remember it was an interesting time for me creatively because I was feeling unsettled because of COVID and everything that the world was going through, but also simultaneously, I was feeling all this internal pressure for some reason, which I've never really felt before. I don't know. I wouldn't exactly call it writer's block, because to me, writer's block is somebody is sitting there and just nothing's happening, nothing's coming, no ideas, or something is blocking the artery that produces ideas. This wasn't that. I was having a lot of ideas, but I couldn't attach myself to any of them. The inner critic that lives inside all screenwriters became a lot louder for some reason post Invisible Man. There was it was just, I just remember it being a difficult time creatively. And at the same time as I'm sort of going down to my home office and having this creative difficulty, the world is falling apart, and my kids are at home every day. My oldest daughter is homeschooling, which was a shit show. And so it really was like when you mentioned that, and then of course we sort of slowly came out of that. I don't know, when did you start to feel like COVID, and I'm not talking about actual dates here, when did you start to feel like that period was ending and that normality was returning?
It felt a while, didn't it? Like, I think even when the kind of lockdown was lifted, it still felt like it was probably at least a year or two, right, before kind of normality set back in again, here at least.
Yeah, so do you feel like somewhere towards the end of 2021 or even into 2022 is when... Yeah, it was interesting when... It was funny. I remember in Los Angeles, obviously there were different rules, and perhaps maybe London was a lot stricter. Certainly in the US, there seemed to be this bizarre culture war happening around COVID, which was not to get too far off topic and turn your podcast into a discussion about COVID, but hey, we're here. I'm in the middle of fires here in Los Angeles. I have no power, so let's get weird.
Let's do it. Let's do it.
But I remember that weird culture war where certain states with more right-leaning governors would say, well, we don't even believe in this thing. Everyone can just do what they want. Stores are open. And then more left-leaning places like Los Angeles, where I live, was like, no, we, outdoor dining only, and, essential things. It was a weird culture war. But I remember when Los Angeles finally did start to open restaurants again for indoor dining, and maybe the staff were maybe wearing a mask, but there was it. I remember sitting there and it felt like normalcy cosplay. Like It didn't feel real. It felt like a bunch of people sitting around play acting that everything was fine, like a lovely picnic at the gates of Auschwitz.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Like and I don't know, did you feel that as well?
Totally. I think the whole world did, didn't they? I think like it really did it. Like you said, I would say it wasn't until maybe 2022, maybe for some people even beyond that, before it really kind of felt like, the real life had kind of resumed again. I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. So
it must have been a weird time for you creatively, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. Just to bring it back to, for the sake of your podcast, the first draft of Wolfman was written during time. I ended up having an idea that I really loved. The power of suggestion was very real in that situation, because my first reaction was, I'm not sure. I just did Invisible Man. I'm not sure that I want to do another monster movie straight after Invisible Man. And then they very cleverly said, well, just tell us what you would do. It's they knew what they were doing, because as soon as I paced around and thought, well, what would I do with the Wolfman story? I hit upon this idea of shifting perspectives and telling a more internal version of a Wolfman transformation. And as soon as I had that idea, I was hooked, and I took the job, and I was like, all right, I'm committing to this. I'm going to write it. I asked my wife to co-write it with me. I just thought this would be a great exercise for us both to do together. And I was pouring all of that uncertainty about COVID that we just discussed, and the lockdown, and feeling isolated, and trying to be a good parent amongst all this adversity, and feeling like I was failing. I was constantly feeling like everybody was parenting better during COVID. I would look at Instagram and people would be like, we're all learning to make honey up in Ojai. The whole, meanwhile, I'm just like wearing the same clothes I've been wearing for 3 weeks. My house looks like a tornado hit it, and I'm trying to build a couch fort for the 600th time in a row. And I'm like, how is it that everyone else is learning beekeeping during the lockdown and I'm the only one that's failing? And so Corbett and we were pouring all of that uncertainty and anxiety into the script. And I think even though the movie now, a few years have gone by, obviously after COVID ended, then there was a huge strike. And so it felt like there was all these tumultuous obstacles that were in the way of this movie. But now that it's finally coming out, it feels like it's a long way from that time. But I can tell you that first draft of the script, and I think this holds in the finished movie, very much holds the uncertainty and anxiety and unsettling feeling that those years of lockdown had. And I don't know, I remember thinking at the time, oh God, there's going to be a whole rash of COVID movies. And that doesn't seem to have eventuated, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I got that 100%. And I think also there's it's interesting you telling me about kind of writing it during that period with your wife as well, because I was going to ask how much of this is personal to you, this story, I suppose, centering on this man who is a father and a husband, and it feels very much kind of about the experience of being a father in this movie, right? Yeah,
absolutely it is. I mean, it's very personal. This film is the most personal film I've made. It was interesting with Invisible Man, because that film very much felt like it was on rails when I was writing it. It felt like the film wanted to be about gaslighting and stalking and domestic abuse. That's what the film was telling me it wanted, and I was really leaning into that. And that was my North Star. Every scene in that movie was geared towards that theme in my mind in some way. And this movie felt very chaotic in a way that reflected that moment in time. The lockdown and the whole COVID thing felt very chaotic to me and unsettling. And so the script felt like that. And so what I mean is that the film didn't feel like it was about one thing. As opposed to The Invisible Man, it felt like it was about many things. And I'm not sure, I know that good reviews are an addictive drug. They're a dangerous drug, right? So when Invisible Man came out, you know, a lot of filmmakers, when they're interviewed, I've heard a lot of filmmakers say in interviews that they don't read reviews, good or bad, that it's not healthy. And I envy that, because if I'm being fully honest with you, I love movie reviews. I'm a film fan, and I use movie reviewers to point me towards movies I may never have heard of. There's a lot of films in my life that I may never have even found without critics. So I utilize critics in my own life as a public good, and I love well-written film criticism. So I have an interesting relationship with critics when it comes to my own movies, because when that laser focus is aimed at my stuff, it's a little more raw, it's a little more vulnerable. But if I'm being honest with you,
of course,
I'm not a masochist. I don't read bad reviews, but I'm going to just come right out and say I do really good reviews, especially if it's a reviewer that I admire and love. If Manola Dargis from the New York Times or Walter Shaw or any of these reviewers that I read, if they're saying good things about a film that I've made, it feels great. And I think that after Invisible Man, I noticed that people were really picking up what I was trying to say. They were. It was very good to see that they were receiving everything I was trying to say about domestic abuse and stalking and everything. And so with Wolfman, I feel like maybe the messiness of it is maybe people won't respond to that messiness. They won't pick up everything I'm trying to say. So this is a super long-winded way of saying an answer to your question about fatherhood, where that's one of the things that's in there. But I feel like there's all this other stuff in there about disease and what it's like to lose someone close to you. There's a disease that's changing them, and there's nothing you can do about it. And suddenly this person you've known your whole life, maybe they don't recognize you anymore.
Yeah.
I haven't personally experienced Alzheimer's in my own family, but I know a lot of people who have. And I can't imagine what it would be like to have your own mother or somebody just look at you like you're a stranger. And so that's in there. And then anxiety about parenting is in there, and anxiety and thinking about our own parents and how you were parented, and marriages. My marriage, it was tough during COVID because we're under pressure. We were arguing, and I think writing the script together was holistic for us because we were putting all those conversations in the script. Anyway, whenever I listen to podcasts, I'm like, gosh, this goes on way too long. And now I'm doing it. I'm taking like 45 minutes to answer one of your questions, which is exactly what you should not do on a podcast.
No, do you know what? That's the dream. The worst thing is when people give me like a one-word answer. That's the nightmare. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Well, really, I have noticed, I guess you get drip fed a lot of podcast moments via social media these days. And I have noticed that people get really vulnerable on podcasts.
Yeah.
More so like someone a celebrity, whether it's Josh Brolin or whoever, Emily Blunt, whoever it is, like when they're doing an interview at a press junket, it's very canned, or if they're on a talk show, it feels very rehearsed. For some reason, the environment of a podcast makes people tell a story they've never told anywhere else.
I love it. Exactly.
So I guess I'm doing that because I'm in the middle of a power outage and everything's chaos right now. So maybe this is the last interview I'll ever do.
Oh my God.
You're getting it all.
Well, tell me a little bit about the werewolf element to this particularly then, because I find it a really interesting kind of subgenre genre, I guess, of horror, because there are some werewolf movies that the whole world kind of unilaterally loves, right? But it feels like there aren't as many successful ones out there as vampire movies or whatever else, right? Like the werewolf movie seems like quite a difficult thing to pull off, doesn't it? Why do you think that is?
It's a great question to ponder. Like I'm answering you in real time, like because these are things that I think about, but I don't have a canned, rehearsed answer for you. Like if I'm thinking about it right now, I'm not sure why that it hasn't been as maybe successful or hit the bullseye as many times as vampire movies. Off the top of my head, I can think of 3 classic vampire movies. But werewolf movies. Obviously, American Werewolf in London was a great film, but it seems to be something people are interested in, but maybe people aren't exploiting the thing about werewolves that is cinematic or compelling. Maybe they're not exploiting that in the right way. I'm not sure. That's an interesting question. I will say this though. I will say that when I was doing Invisible Man, I remember thinking, I never want to put down anybody else's work ever, but I do remember thinking, I don't know that there's been a great Invisible Man movie, a great Invisible Man. You've got the original, which is obviously a classic, but it's this museum piece now. It's so far removed from the times we live in. I couldn't think of anyone who had exploited that character in that way. And that gave me a freedom. And maybe this sounds like hubris, but I remember thinking, I'm going to make the first great, terrifying Invisible Man movie.
Yeah.
I'm going to make the version of this that is definitive. And I have to say, I did have a little bit of that feeling on this one too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you did. I mean, for my money, it's the best and scariest werewolf film, like in at least the last 20 years, I would say. So, like, I think it's tremendous, and I think I wonder if part of it, the difficulty with getting a good werewolf movie is the werewolf itself, the design of it, right? Like, it must have been a really difficult thing, like this kind of animal that walks around on 2 legs and is kind of human but kind of not. Like, tell me a little bit about the design of your werewolf, I suppose, and how to pull that off and make it threatening and make it scary.
It was, for me, it was a question of making it real, because I knew that most movies in the past, if not all, who had dealt with werewolves in some way had taken on a very literal version of it, i.e. a person, usually a man, transforms into an actual wolf, with the snout and everything. And even the amazing, incredible Rick Baker transformation scene from American Werewolf in London, he grows. We see that amazing shot where his face stretches out into a snout, a wolf snout. And so that's a very specific thing. I think that gets into more of a folklore territory when you actually have a human turning into an actual animal covered in fur with paws and a snout and everything. And I was thinking, okay, for my version, I wonder if I can come at this more from a disease angle and have it be still please the werewolf fans and the Wolfman fans, give them something horrific, but ground it more to the degree where the audience feels like he's just being affected by a terrible disease. So that was the whole approach. When I first got in touch with Arian, who did the makeup, we talked a lot about that, and we looked at pictures online of different facial disfigurements and diseases, leprosy, things where the face would be changed enough, and it's almost like molding clay. Like Arian had like a clay face that he would just push around just a little bit. It's amazing what you can do with the human face if you just misalign it a little bit.
Right, yeah.
And so then the trick became, how do we do this in a way where it suggests a wolf? Because we don't want to suggest an ape or a tiger. Like
Yeah.
yes, we want to be grounded. Yes, we want it to be a disease, but it's called Wolfman. Like we need to do something. So that felt like a tiny sliver we were trying to push through.
Yeah, and I think I love that element to it, that I guess it felt more to me like, for example, David Cronenberg's The Fly, more than any other kind of classic werewolf movie, right? Were there any particular kind of filmic inspirations, I suppose, that you took from in that way?
I think so, yeah. I mean, definitely The Fly, and I was also thinking a lot about other practical effects driven films that I had grown up with, like The Thing, which is another film that is about isolation and dread. You know, that film, that those guys are cut off from society. Obviously, it has these amazing practical effects. So the Thing and The Fly are two of my favorite films. So,
yeah,
and they're not exactly obscure. Like most horror fans around the world would cite those two movies as favorites. But they did seem like North Stars in terms of their tone. Brain Dead, the Peter Jackson film, or as it's titled in the US, Dead Alive. I think that's the US title. Those using practical effects to do the grossest thing possible and howling with laughter, and it's so much fun. I mean, have you ever watched Evil Dead 2 with an audience? It's crazy, right? Yeah. It's fun.
Yeah.
And I'm a big fan of those movies, those oozy 80s movies that are just fun and funny. What distinguishes The Thing and The Fly is that they were using the same level of practical effects, but they didn't want you to laugh. There was nothing, you know, people may say, what are you talking about? The scene where that guy's chest opens up and that's hilarious. And I'm like, well, you know, people find Terrifier 3 funny too. So we can never dictate what's going to make some complete gorehound laugh, right? But that wasn't John Carpenter's intention. He, in no way did he want to make you laugh. He was trying to make something so intense and so filled with dread. And it was nihilistic, The Thing. Like the ending of The Thing is just total nihilism. You know, it's not a happy ending. And so that is why I was using them as a North Star, because that's how I wanted to use practical effects in this movie. I wanted to use them to cause a feeling of intense dread. But other movies, I held a film festival during pre-production and I was showing the crew films like Under the Skin, which is, I find that movie just very divorced from humanity.
Yeah.
It's probably the best movie I've ever seen to capture an alien's point of view of our world.
Yeah, agreed.
You feel the same way?
Yeah, it's like you're looking through an alien lens or something, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's incredible. Yeah.
It's funny. I feel that too. Like, and that's what a trick that he pulled off. What an amazing cinematic feat! Like to truly look at the world through an alien set of eyes. So in the more animalistic sections of the movie, I was thinking that's what I want to achieve. I want this film to feel like we are the animal. We're seeing the world. I was showing them even films like Amour, where it's like just watching a couple fall apart and deal with a severe. So I was showing them a whole range of movies that sort of contained something about what I was trying to get at.
I love that. Well, Leigh, we're out of time already, but thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure.
Oh, man. Are you probably... I'm going to take a guess and say you had about 12 more questions that I didn't let you get to because my answers were too long.
I did, but alas, I still absolutely loved getting the chance to speak to you, Leigh, and I loved the film, so thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you. I enjoyed talking to you. It's very holistic to talk about stuff like this. Thank you.
There we go, the incredible Leigh Whannell. Bit of a chaotic interview, but it was really lovely to chat to him. I'm so grateful for his time. So let's get into our in-depth, spoilerific review of Wolfman. So I will say we will be spoiling the movie from the very beginning of this conversation. So if you don't want to be spoiled on Wolfman, go and see the film first before you listen to the rest of this episode. Joining me to discuss all things Wolfman, I mean, one of my very favourite people, one of my very favourite podcasters. He is, of course, the host host of pretty much the world's biggest movie podcast, the Empire Podcast. It's Chris Hewitt. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Mike Muncer. How are you?
I'm really good, thank you. How are you? How's 2025 treating you so far?
It's okay. It's all right. It's not. It's been not too bad so far. I saw Wolfman.
Hey,
that was good.
There you go. I know
Yeah.
this was that was my first kind of new movie, my first screening of the year. Actually, nice one to kick off with. Really,
What's
wasn't
it?
it?
We watched it next to each other. We should we tell the folks at home?
Yeah.
We watched it sitting next to each other.
We did, side by side. We both, I could feel there were those moments like anticipating jump scares when both of us were slightly like clenching, you know?
I went too early on one. It wasn't ideal either because the screening room we saw it in, they didn't turn the lights off.
Yeah.
On the screen for about the first 40 to 45 minutes or so.
Mm-hmm.
And that meant that we were sitting in the front row and we were bathed in light. And so all my usual tricks in horror films, you know, I'm a big horror film guy, but I'm a scaredy cat. So, you know, all my usual tricks were just, I had no hiding place.
Yeah.
So there was a jump scare, and at one point I was anticipating the jump scare, and I went too early with the knee jump.
Yeah, I think I remember
And then the jump scare happened.
And I think your knee jump then made me jump, and then it was kind of like a double jump, you know? So, yeah. Yeah.
And that was just a trailer.
I know. Well, there you go. So, yeah, let's talk about it. So, Wolfman, which is out in cinemas this weekend, the new movie from Leigh Whannell. And this is his first movie in about, 5 years. He did The Invisible Man right before the pandemic. Again, for a lot of people, I think that was one of their very last kind of cinema experiences, right? Before COVID hit. What's your thoughts, before we get into this movie specifically, what are your thoughts generally on Leigh Whannell as a horror filmmaker, Chris? You a fan of his work?
I think he's great. Yeah, I think he's really, really terrific. I love his work as a writer. I think he has a really demented, inventive quality to a lot of his work. I can just imagine him when he's writing something like an Insidious Part 2, and it does that Back to the Future Part 2 thing of it starts to fold back on itself and starts to go through the first movie. And there's some really, really crazy stuff that happens in there when they get to the further. I can just imagine him as a writer just cackling away. But, you know, I interviewed him for the Empire Podcast spoiler special for Wolfman. And we started reflecting towards the end. I don't know how spoilerific we want to get here.
Let's go full spoilers.
Okay. So we started reflecting on the fact that in Wolfman, the lead character Blake chews his own foot off, and was that or an intentional callback to Saw? And then he started, you know, it kind of was and it kind of wasn't, but he was okay with it. I think he's okay with embracing his legacy in that way. But he got quite reflective about his impact on modern horror and what he and James Wan had done with Saw, you know, and then going into, you know, things like the Insidious movies. Yeah, I think he's a really, really clever and inventive writer, and his impact on horror is huge. And then he steps up as a director, and, you know, the Insidious sequel he directed is fine, but I think the likes of Upgrade and certainly The Invisible Man, I think, show that there's a director of real promise here.
Yes.
So I'm on board. I'm on board the Leigh Whannell train.
Me too. I think he is like, it's funny because like you say, he kind of rose to success with Saw that him and James Wan created, and they were kind of very much a partnership in those early days, weren't they? They made the Saw franchise together, then they made the Insidious franchise together. He was often writing, James Wan often directing, and then I feel like James Wan really took off as being this kind of, you know, this kind of master of horror, of the kind of haunted house movie. And it almost feels like Leigh Whannell doesn't get the props that he deserves, because I think he is like maybe low key one of our best horror filmmakers working. You know, I think The Invisible Man is kind of his masterpiece, right? I think, you know, I think that film was astounding. So yeah, I'm glad that he's continuing to make these interesting movies, and
he's doing stuff that's really interesting visually as well. And we'll talk about what he does in Wolfman in a few minutes, I guess. But you know, there are camera moves and bits of camera trickery in The Invisible Man that are still, I think, really, really impressive. What he does in Upgrade as well, where he tethers the camera to the kind of the body language of the lead character as he begins to receive the upgrade. I think all that's really, really terrific. And there's a little bit of that in Wolfman, not a lot. Wolfman's a bit more grounded than the other two, I would say.
It is. Yeah, it is. I want to talk to you about the visuals, actually, particularly for this movie, because, yeah, there were some interesting choices being made, I think. Well, let's get into it, shall we? So just to give a little brief setup to the film, I guess, it's a pretty simple setup, actually. We basically follow this main character of Blake, played by Christopher Abbott. At the beginning, we see his childhood growing up in this kind of very rural environment, I think in Oregon, right? He grows up with a very kind of strict, protective dad, and there is maybe some sort of creature living in the woods pursuing them. Then we jump to 30 years later. He is a grown adult, this character of Blake, played by Christopher Abbott. He now has his own wife, Charlotte, played by Julia Garner, and his own daughter, Ginger, played by Matilda Firth. And he receives some bad news at the beginning that his father, his estranged father, they haven't really been in touch in decades, but his father has passed away. He needs to go back to his house, the house that he grew up in the middle of the woods in Oregon, in order to kind of sort out his possessions, his father's possessions, and kind of, sort out kind of his estate, I guess, in a way. So he traveled with his family to the back end of nowhere in Oregon, and they are attacked by some sort of wolf-like creature. They crash, veer off the road. They take shelter in the house he grew up in, but Christopher Abbott's character of Blake has been infected. He's kind of scratched or bitten by the werewolf, and he then begins to turn. And the movie kind of then takes place across one night in this house in the middle of the woods, a kind of cabin in the woods type setup, right? Where Blake is slowly transforming into a werewolf. He has to find a way to keep his wife and daughter safe. So that's kind of the plot in a nutshell. It's a nice, simple plot. Pretty much it takes place entirely across just one night in one location with 3 characters and a wolf, right? So it's pretty stripped back, especially in comparison to The Invisible Man. What did you think of it, Chris, first of all? What are your general overall thoughts? How did it compare to other Leigh Whannell movies for you?
I think that is probably, for me, not quite up there with Invisible Man.
Yeah.
And I certainly think there's nothing in the movie that has the impact of the restaurant scene from that film.
Right.
Which is just, I think, one of the great horror scenes for the last 10 years, just one of the great shocks of the last 10 years or so.
Yes.
Absolutely terrific. But I had a really good time with it. I think it's a really interesting film to talk about. I'm glad we're talking about it, and maybe we'll be talking about it more in the Empire podcast spoiler special as well. Yes. We'll be sick of each other by the end of this, Mike. But I think it's really, really interesting, like what it does thematically. You could apply all kinds of readings to what Blake is going through, but having spoken to Leigh Whannell and Chris Abbott, who plays Blake, there's certainly the idea of dementia.
Yes,
is something that runs through the film, and being with a family member and watching them lose themselves while you're in the same room with them, and that feeling of, it's never happened to me personally, but I know people who've gone through it, and that feeling of being unsettled and unseated by that. Is something that really, really runs through this film. It's an interesting one because when you heard Leigh Whannell was going to make Wolfman, I think we all got very, very excited and hoped that he might be able to pull the same sort of tech upgrade that he did with Invisible Man, and he doesn't. He goes the other way, and he goes primal in a way, and it's nothing to do with technology. It's all about disease and infection and decay.
Yeah.
And it's really, really good, but I think one of the key creative decisions, because it's a Blumhouse movie and they had to keep the scale, relatively speaking, small scale. Part of that means that you only have a couple of characters to root for. And I found that I didn't really believe that Blake posed a significant, genuine threat to Charlotte and Ginger in the last 20 minutes of the movie.
Right.
Because I thought that he was a man fighting himself, and that there was a lack of characters in the movie, an absence of characters in the movie that could conceivably die.
Yeah.
And so I felt that the last 20 minutes, whilst really, really interesting, lacked that tension that you get in the first hour and a half or so, where you have the Grady character particularly running around the movie and generating that tension, because literally anything could happen at that point within reason.
Yeah, I agree. I thought it was great, a really good, and I think a really good werewolf film as well, which we'll get into because I feel like they're quite hard and they're quite few and far between actually, like really decent classic werewolf movies. I think it's great. I agree, it's not quite reaching the heights of The Invisible Man, and I think that last act particularly maybe is where it falls down. There is some really great stuff in the first half though, and I think particularly that opening scene is so tense, so scary, so compelling. The kind of Christopher Abbott's character Blake, the opening scene with 30 years earlier in his childhood going hunting with his dad, hiding out in the little treehouse hide thing, right? I thought that stuff was genius, like classic Leigh Whannell kind of haunted house horror almost kind of scares. It
has this amazing moment where they're in the deer blind and Grady is looking at the door and you can see the breath of the Wolfman and the breath disappears.
Yeah.
And then he's like, where the hell is it? And then we pan just across from him and we can see the breath of the Wolfman appearing from behind him.
Yeah.
That opening is really, really strong and he really teases the audience. He's a very, very knowing filmmaker, Leigh Whannell, and he teases the audience brilliantly in that and doesn't quite pay it off. But obviously there's a lot that's going on there. There's a lot of setup. There's a lot of setup of Grady's fate.
Yeah.
There's a lot of setup of the relationship between Grady and Blake, which I think is really interesting. I've only seen the film once, so I definitely want to see it again.
Yeah.
I was given the production notes, where I don't know, I'm sure you were as well. And unusually I read them.
Yes.
And the production notes mention that Blake's mum is quite important in that opening as well, but I don't remember her being in it. I wonder if she was cut out quite late in the day, that his mother is dying of basically Lou Gehrig's disease, and that's one of the reasons why his relationship with his father is fraught. This is all in the production notes, but it's not that I recall in the movie. No. It's one of the things I didn't get around to talking about with Leigh Whannell. I think that it's interesting because if they'd left that in, I think that would have explained a lot and really fed more into the themes of decay.
That's interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that. I just assumed he lived on his own with his dad in that little house in the middle of nowhere, right? And it was just the two of them kind of isolated, which I didn't mind actually. But yeah, I think you're right. That definite feeling of disease. Leigh Whannell spoke to me about this, we spoke about The Invisible Man coming out right on the cusp of COVID. And he talked about this movie in comparison feeling like a very post-COVID movie. Like, I think he was really thinking about it. It's a personal movie to him. He actually wrote it with his wife. He is a husband and a father. And that feeling of disease, of being isolated, of maybe somebody you love being infected by something. And I think that's what's really interesting about it. I think maybe a lot of people might go to this film thinking it's going to be this kind of American Werewolf in London or werewolfy type movie. And it's more akin to something like The Fly, isn't it, really? Like one of those kind of sad stories about a man's body kind of decaying and disintegrating and being destroyed in front of the people that he loves. And I love that stuff actually, but it's going to be interesting to see what audiences' reactions to it are going to be,
Yeah, because I also think it doesn't have as many jump scares as you might think. I mean, obviously you and I in particular, where my knee was going. Especially in the first hour or so.
I'm bad with particularly a Leigh Whannell or a James Wan jump scare. Like those two are very good at them, aren't they? That's the thing.
Yeah. Really good. Yeah. They're the masters of misdirection. But it's really interesting because I think it is about that. I found it really heartrending, actually, to be honest, the movie. The werewolves traditionally on film, there aren't that many werewolf stories that don't end tragically. There aren't that many werewolf movies that don't end with the Wolfman dying in some horrible way. And you're watching this guy, and it leans into that very, very much so. You're watching this guy lose the run of himself over the course of a movie, and I thought that was a really, really beautiful masterstroke, actually, on Leigh Whannell's part. I don't think, I'm not claiming to say I've seen every single werewolf movie ever made, although I'm certainly going to give it a damn good go. But of the ones I've seen, I don't think I've ever seen one do what he does here, which is kind of clearly delineate the world of the humans and then the Wolfman, and those beautiful sort of POV switches that he pulls off, that rug pull he pulls off about halfway through the film, where we've been with Blake and we think that we know Blake's going to turn, right?
Yeah.
We know that he's turning, but we don't know how far gone he is until there's that first POV switch, and then you realize that Charlotte, his wife, is just terrified because his face is showing palpable signs of transformation. His speech is changing and slurring. It's really, really fascinating. I've never seen that before.
No,
in a werewolf movie.
No, usually with werewolves, right, there is something a lot more kind of supernatural, even in the world of the film. It's this kind of curse, right? This curse of the werewolf. You turn in 3, on a full moon. Silver bullets might kill you, right? That kind of thing. And there's none of that here. It is much more like it does away with a lot of that kind of werewolf mythology in a way, doesn't it? And it's treated much more as like an infection, like something that you will catch and it will just transform you sort of biologically, I suppose.
Yeah, and then I think that means that the tension does ramp up a little bit. Like so I never thought for a second that Ginger, the daughter, was going to die, but it didn't mean that Charlotte, the mother, couldn't, or that the movie might end on a gotcha moment where we think they've got away, and then Charlotte realizes that she's infected too. And because this doesn't adhere to the traditional rules of werewolves, if you're infected, and that's it. And it's got nothing to do with where the moon is. It's got nothing to do with anything like that. So you're fucked, essentially.
Yeah.
I thought there was a chance that might happen towards the end of the movie, but what he does is, by introducing it, the possibility of it, she's not going to die, but she might get scratched. She might get scraped, and a scrape seems to be enough to transmit this infection. So, it's a really, really clever idea. I hope it does well, because I'd love to see. I don't know whether he would play with this idea again, but I'd love to see this idea that there's an infection, and you'd have to think, Mike, that the infection will be known to the world after the events of this movie,
right?
Because there are 2 corpses of people who've been infected with lycanthropy.
Yes. Yeah.
Near the house. So
yeah, you'd think.
There's proof.
I'm glad in a way as well, just by the way. I mean, I didn't expect this anyway, but I'm glad that it in no way alluded to being connected to the Invisible Man, that they're not doing some sort of shared monster universe here, really. They don't seem to be, at least, right? There's nothing that would suggest this in any way takes place in the same world, right, as the Invisible Man.
The only thing that suggests there is crossover, I need to go back and see the film again, is that at the end of the credits, there is a credit acknowledging footage used from The Invisible Man.
Oh.
So at some point, footage from The Invisible Man does show up in this movie, and I want to know where.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. Yeah.
Yeah. And it might be just something in the background. Maybe they're watching it on TV at some point. I don't know. But maybe it does take place in the shared universe. I hope not.
Let's talk about werewolf movies for a moment, because I think it's a really interesting one. It's kind of, such a well-known sort of monster and subgenre, if we want to call it that. And yet, actually, there are relatively few, like compared to like a vampire movie or a monster movie, it feels like there are very few kind of successful werewolf movies, right? Everyone thinks of maybe the original Wolfman of American Werewolf in London, maybe The Howling, Dog Soldiers, Ginger Snaps, like a few.
You could just reeled off a whole bunch there.
yeah. But I feel like you could probably name most of the really great ones on 2 hands, right? I think that's really interesting. Why do you think it's so hard to get a werewolf movie right?
That's a very, very good question. If I knew, I'd be making a dozen of them right now.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I wonder if it's the werewolf itself, the monster design.
I think so. I think it's very hard to make it look terrifying, right? Like I rewatched the other week, rewatched the Hammer movie, the Curse of the Werewolf.
Oh, yeah.
The Oliver Reed movie. And when he turns towards the end of that film, he looks like a little puppy.
Yes.
And it's so unscary.
Yeah.
It's a weird one. I think also maybe the shadow of American Werewolf looms large over this whole subgenre. Not that it would stop anyone from doing it, but I think even this movie wrestles with that and doesn't quite get past the American Werewolf bump in the road, which is, that is the greatest transformation sequence in the history of cinema, probably not just werewolf films, but actual cinema. And if you're going into this, if you're playing in this playground, you better bring it. So maybe that's one of the reasons, but if you look at it from Wolfman of London, what was that, early 40s, to American Werewolf and Howling, obviously, which came out the same year, there aren't that many werewolf movies.
No.
Not really. And it's really, really interesting. I wonder if maybe there's something to do with the fact that the werewolves, for the most part, seem to have a lack of agency.
Yeah.
Because they're completely taken over by the beast for the most part, although you can mess with that, of course, to your heart's content. That maybe they don't quite stick in people's minds the way that vampires or Dracula do, or something like zombies do in a very, very different way.
Yeah.
I don't know. I really wish I knew, but you're right. If you look back, really from the 40s on, there's maybe 30, 30, 40 werewolf movies that are worth your time, and in terms of greats, 5?
Yeah.
6?
Genuinely, yeah. Like, very few, I would say. It's really interesting. I was thinking about this. I even spoke to Leigh Whannell about it, and he said he didn't really know the answer to that either, apart from that I think it is a hard thing to get right and make scary, the werewolf. Like, this kind of strange animal-human hybrid that is a wolf but stands on 2 legs, and like, I don't know. I think without a good makeup artist, right, without a Rick Baker, and without that kind of a budget, it's a hard thing to pull off as like a micro-budget genre movie too, right? Compared to a zombie movie, I think, for example, where you can just coat people in blood and people shuffle around or whatever. Like, I just imagine a werewolf movie technically is a much harder thing to pull off, you know?
Yeah, and also the rules as well, right? So, with a vampire movie, sometimes you can tweak the rules so they walk around in the day, but for the most part, that the vampire is going to come out at night. Oh, you better get back home because the vampire is going to come out, and you have all these different rules. And with the werewolf movie, for the most part, it's like, oh, they come out every few days, every month.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, there are some really fun, interesting kind of metaphors that filmmakers have used the werewolf for, right? Like Ginger Snaps, obviously this really interesting kind of coming of age female kind of story about, turning into a monster for a few nights of the month as an adolescent teen, which I think works so well. Here he's gone for a really interesting, because obviously The Invisible Man really very much told a kind of female story in a way, right? A very post-Me Too kind of female story. And in this movie, he's flipped it. It's very much a male story, isn't it? I think, like that kind of what it means to be a protector, quote unquote, of your family, a father and a husband, and the kind of the pressures and the fears and the anxieties of that, I suppose. And I think he does a really good job with that stuff in this movie,
Yeah, I would say that maybe the Charlotte character, the Julia Garner character, isn't quite fleshed out enough. So the movie's meant to flip, so she becomes a protector at the end of the film, and so she begins to connect with this daughter that she has literally said earlier on in the film that she feels she's losing, and she doesn't have the same connection to Ginger that Blake does.
Yeah.
And then the circumstances obviously force her to do that. But I still worry at the end of the film, they have that shot of them sitting in the valley that makes everything feel better. They're really testing the powers of that valley. Do we feel better now that we've watched our
I know. I was like,
father?
Is that going to heal you? I'm not sure. I know nature is beautiful
shot him in the
and
face.
everything, but yeah.
Let's give it a go. Let's give it a go. Oh, it's healing powers. Yeah. But like after that, I don't know. Charlotte, it's one of those things that movies can do this sometimes where a parent who's perhaps not exactly got their eye on the road suddenly then becomes a super parent over the course of the movie. And I don't think that Charlotte does that. I think the protective instinct kicks in, of course. And there's some great scenes at the moment where she basically stands and stares Blake down and almost growls at him, and that makes him think twice, and then he wanders off for a second. But otherwise, I don't know that this movie is going to transform her relationship with Ginger any. I think I worry about where that relationship's going to go down the line.
Yes, that's a really good point actually, because I guess the setup is right. He's the stay-at-home dad, and he's a writer. She's the kind of like career woman in a way, right? She's a journalist. She's kind of very much into her job. She talks about how she has this slight strained relationship with her daughter, that her daughter doesn't quite get on with her in the same way that she does Blake. And yeah, you're right. I guess the film wants it to go on that journey, right? Where she, the mother and daughter find this kind of connection by the end. But yeah, maybe that's a little half-baked by the end. I'm not sure that I necessarily bought into that either. That by the time they're there staring at a valley together, that everything's all good with them. I don't know.
Oh, I don't think that at all. Absolutely. I think weirdly enough, Leigh Whannell, he does traffic in unhappy endings, doesn't he? So Upgrade, without giving too much away, that has a bit of a whammer of an ending as well. Saw, obviously, famously, has
bit of a downer.
bit of a downer. And I wonder about this one as well. But I think this is, I think Invisible Man might be the only one really in which there's a hero who incontrovertibly triumphs at the end.
That is really
possibly
interesting.
Even like the Insidious movies have those little twists and turns, don't they? At the end, for the most part.
What do you think of Christopher Abbott then? As our lead man, he's such an interesting actor, isn't he? Like, he doesn't yet feel like a household name in the way that I think maybe he should be, right? But what do you think of him in this?
I don't think he wants to be. I think that's I interviewed him for 19 minutes, so I know the man intimately.
Amazing.
But I just get the feeling from reading stuff and from just watching his choice of projects over the years that this is a man who does not want to be a movie star. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, he looks like he looks.
Yeah.
So people are going to try and push him towards becoming that. It's really interesting because, of course, this was meant to be Ryan Gosling for a long, long time. Yeah. And it's hard not to look at this movie and think about what Gosling would have done to it. And I think Gosling is it's really interesting because I think Gosling is a very likable and is a more likable screen presence than Christopher Abbott. Mm-hmm. And Christopher Abbott's presence in movies tends to be, I tend to relate him with, movies that are not going to be easy sits.
Yeah.
And his characters, I'm thinking back to Possessor,
Poor Things, even, where he's a monster in that, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Absolutely. Piercing, like odd films as well.
Oddballs and really dangerous energy to him as well. And this movie plays on that really, really interestingly because he is the nicest guy in the world for the first 45 minutes of this film, even when he's changing. Weirdly, like I said earlier on, I didn't believe that Blake was going to, when he turns, I didn't believe that he was going to go through with it and kill his family.
Yeah.
Even when he's chasing them down at the end and he's chewed his leg off and he's running after them like a three-legged dog, I felt that was just more like certainly an animalistic thing, an instinctive thing. Maybe he was going to kill them. Maybe you feel differently, Mike. But I felt that he was just like, "Hey, what about me? You've forgotten me," kind of thing.
I think so. I mean, I think I definitely felt that conflict, obviously, that he didn't want to hurt them. But I did think eventually we're going to get to the point where he is completely gone. Whatever was left of Blake is gone, and then he is going to try and kill them. But you're right. In a way, the actual sort of the real monster of the film is, in fact, Blake's dad, the other werewolf, right? I mean, that's the monster that they've got to evade for the majority of the film. Yeah. Again, like, interesting choice in that regard, that it's not really Blake until the very, very last minute in a way. So yeah, but it's not quite that kind of The Shining trajectory, right? Where you really believe this man is going to kill his family by the end. Yeah,
no, that's absolutely And I would have thought ordinarily that casting Christopher Abbott means that you go into the last 30 minutes of the movie thinking that anything could happen, and yet there's an innate decency to Blake that I think, for me, coloured the last 20 minutes. But I know Leigh Whannell feels differently because we had a slight disagreement about that in terms of I felt that Blake wasn't going to hurt Charlotte and Ginger, and he feels that towards the end that he is the animal and he will hurt them.
Yeah.
Maybe I was just being far too glass half full towards the end of that movie. But it is really interesting. It's an interesting twist with Sam Yeager, I think his name is. That's how you pronounce it, I think, who plays Grady. That's a really, really interesting twist. And whenever he's around, there's a real edge to the movie. That sequence when they're trying to start the truck and he's going to appear somewhere.
Yeah.
is, I think, one of the best in the film.
Some amazing set pieces. I really love the sequence as well when they first arrive at these woods and they bump into an old childhood friend of Blake's, right? Played by, I think, Benedict Hardy, who is this guy who kind of grew up in this kind of rural area, has never left.
He's a Derek, and Derek's don't run.
Derek, that's it. That's his name. Yeah. Derek is terrifying from the beginning, and he gets into the car with this family and he's like, I'll take you to where you need to go. And you just know there is this fear, this tension, you know, this gun-toting local. You think, what's he going to do? You can feel Charlotte's tension and Ginger's fear as well. And I think all of that is played out so well. Again, that kind of clash, that sort of test of masculinity, I suppose, and that awkwardness of Christopher Abbott's character in terms of how he should react to this other man, you know?
Well, it's territorial, isn't it?
Yeah.
So he's, you know, he has his territory, which is the inside of this truck, and then this other character comes in and invades his territory and basically challenges him for alpha dominance.
Yeah.
All in the space of that. I really love that sequence. I think it's really, really inventive, as I said earlier on. But there's something about this movie is not what I thought it was going to be, and that character is not what I thought he was going to be. When he turned up, I thought, oh, so he's Derek, so he's the son of Dan. I'm trying to remember. Dan is the character we hear on the radio to Grady.
That's right.
At the beginning of the
and
movie.
Grady's like, you've got to protect your boy and I'll protect mine kind of thing. Yeah.
And clearly that goes horribly wrong. So Grady and Dan team up to go into the woods to hunt down the Wolfman, and at least Grady gets transformed and is never seen again. And that's really interesting. There's lots of stuff about that. So I was wondering then, is Derek aware of Grady?
Yeah.
Does Derek know that Blake's coming back? Grady is clearly territorial. He's hanging around where he used to live. So, you know, Derek's in the deer blind at night. Why is he in the deer blind at night? These are all questions I now, with hindsight, wish I'd asked Leigh Whannell, but we went down a different path.
I know.
You know, so, you know, does he know that he's out there? Is he keeping an eye on things? So when Blake shows up, is he thinking, hang on, you're the son of the guy that is kind of directly responsible for the death of my dad.
Yeah.
So there's a real tension there. And then everything happens and goes in a different direction, and Derek ends up wolf food very, very quickly.
Oh, that is such a good twist, that moment when they're driving at night and you're so aware of Derek as this potential threat, and then all of a sudden they see something in the road, swerve off, and you get this amazing truck crash sequence, right, where it's kind of hanging over a cliff almost. The family have to kind of crawl out to safety. The wolf is there in the rearview mirror. Like, there's some great stuff in that sequence. I loved it.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought it was really, really, really terrific. And obviously that's the pivotal moment of the film, right? That's where Blake gets scratched or mauled, I guess, as well. It was really, really good. Yeah. What did you think of the makeup and the reveals, the big reveals? And we don't really get to see what either Wolfman looks like until quite late in the film.
I quite liked it because, like you said, I think when it comes to any werewolf movie ever, John Landis's American Werewolf in London looms large, right? It kind of overshadows everything. You're gonna be comparing it naturally in your head to Rick Baker's amazing stuff in that movie, and I think he did something quite clever with this, Leigh Whannell, where this movie doesn't have a werewolf transformation moment, right? It's gradual. It's like the whole film almost, or the whole second half of the film is a slow, gradual werewolf transformation. So it happens kind of gradually, and it's much more body horror. It's much more Cronenbergy. It's much more The Fly. It's much more kind of like him getting ill and bits of him dropping off and bits of him rotting away. Yeah. So I like that he took a completely different spin on it. It wasn't so much this kind of tearing off his shirt and his face elongating and hair sprouting out of his face all at once or anything like that. It kind of happens slowly and subtly. So I guess it's not as kind of overtly impressive in a way where you're going, wow, look at the amazing effects, because it's happening more subtly throughout the movie. But I did really like it. I believed it, if that makes sense. Yeah. What did you think?
I liked it. I thought it skirts a fine line. I'd be interested to watch this with an audience of you know, quote unquote real people rather than us jaded, cynical film hacks.
Yes.
Because I think genuinely at times the Blake look in particular could be goofy. And I think there are moments in this where he begins to lose his hair, and it essentially the last 20 minutes of the movie is Julia Garner and Matilda Firth being menaced by a man with a comb over. And, as a man with a comb over, I respected it. I recognized it. I thought, yes, striking a blow for people with comb overs finally on the big screen.
Good representation. Thanks, Leigh Whannell.
Yeah, absolutely. But otherwise, I didn't think it was that scary. The Grady one, though, the complete transformation, the completely transformed Grady, I thought was really, really good. And again, having seen the movie only once, I really want to go back and see it a couple of times. And ideally, one day we'll be able to see it on home video and stuff.
Yeah.
Home video? What are we in the 80s? And be able to pause it because, we get the glimpses of him, don't we? We get to see his silhouette outside the house. We get to see...
Love that.
There's that shot of him whenever Blake is driving along and suddenly sees him lit up in the middle of the road. So how much do we see at that moment?
Yeah.
Because it's just a split second. How much do we see later on whenever he's on the windscreen of the truck, in the truck sequence, when they're trying to start the engine. So how much of him do we see before we get the sort of the big fight between Grady and Blake in the house? Be fascinated. But certainly what I saw of the Grady makeup, it looked really, really good.
Yeah. I agree, and I think it's more about that kind of, again, he's so much more concentrating on the internal kind of mental, psychological, emotional breakdown, right? And there are some great moments with that. Like, I love that moment when he's starting to notice things are getting weirder. His senses are changing. He smells the rotten meat in the other room, in the storage room, and that moment where he can hear massive, loud footsteps in the attic, right? And he goes upstairs, opens the door, and it's a tiny little, well, actually not that tiny, but a house spider crawling up the wall, and he's hearing those 8 legs like they're kind of like it's some mammoth creature kind of barreling about. I love all those little touches. I thought that was great.
Yeah, that was terrific, because what you're expecting as an audience member is for the Wolfman, the Grady Wolfman.
Yeah.
We don't know it's Grady at that point, but we suspect strongly it's Grady. And we think he's going to do what Blake later does, which is to break in through an upper window.
Yeah.
And then get into the house. And you think, there's going to be a moment where he's going to come jumping out of that cupboard, or he's going to be under the bed for some reason. He breaks into a house and hides under a bed. Why would he do that? But he might, because of jump scares. And none of that happens. Instead, you get that sound effect of the spider was terrific, and is a callback to the opening shot of the movie, which is a wasp being attacked and dragged down by a bunch of ants, and the sound design of that is really, really funky as well. I loved all of that stuff. The scene where he smells the rotting meat, and then he eats foul beef jerky, which then makes him throw up and then lose one of his teeth.
And his teeth come out. Yeah.
That's the trigger. That's the moment where we realize as an audience, that's the first switch in POV. That's the first moment where we realize, oh shit, this is much further along than we think it is, because we've only been seeing Blake's POV so far. It's so well done.
Yeah.
Love that stuff.
Yeah. The visuals are amazing, actually. I think and I think by the time we get to the house, so after the truck crash happens and they make it to the house and they barricade themselves in, that's where it becomes pretty apparent, like, okay, the rest of the film is just going to take place across one night, right? It's going to be a one-night movie with just basically 3 people in a house. Do you think ultimately that was a good decision? Like, do you think that works to the film's advantage, that the rest of the film almost in real time, right, with just these 3 people in a house?
With the exception of, I think it doesn't give us time for Charlotte to be fleshed out particularly.
Yeah.
I think it's a really good idea. Looking back at some of the great werewolf movies we've mentioned, a lot of them take place over a fairly significant span of time.
Yeah, because usually you have to wait for like the next full moon and all of this kind of thing, right? Yeah,
precisely. Yeah, absolutely that. And in the case of American Werewolf, it takes place over a few weeks, because David's in hospital for a little while as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's really interesting. Curse the Werewolf takes place over years, but I guess it's such an interesting approach to the werewolf movie, and I think that Leigh Whannell has got this kind of freshness of approach, and he really thinks, what's not been done before in this genre, and it might have been done in a movie I haven't seen, but I love that. I thought it was really, really great. And what it also does is it means that the call is coming from inside the house.
Yeah.
which is great in that you have this outside threat of the Grady Wolfman, who is running around the house like a poison pill trying to get in. Meanwhile, you have this burgeoning threat inside the house that you know is going to become a clear and present danger at some point.
Yes.
And they're going to have to deal with him at some point. And that means they're going to have to get out of the house at some point. But if they get out of the house, there's an even worse one outside.
Yeah.
All that stuff I thought was great. All the territorial stuff with Grady Wolfman versus Blake Wolfman and Blake's protective instincts being raised and his hackles being raised. I thought all of it was really, really great. And I think there's a really interesting... The title alone, I think, is interesting. The fact that it's Wolf Man. And it's not the Wolf Man, because there's more than one of them in this movie. And it's not the Wolf Man, one word. It's Wolf Man. I thought that was really interesting because it is ultimately about this man's struggle to retain his humanity and to hold on to himself for as long as he possibly can so that his wife and daughter can survive. That was not an accident for me. I think that's a really, really interesting way of presenting the title.
Yeah, I love that.
All of that stuff. I love that.
I love that, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It has a vibe, setting it in an old house like that across one night. It has Night of the Living Dead vibes for me.
Yeah.
Even Evil Dead, right? It's kind of like, I guess it's kind of a Cabin in the Woods movie in certain ways, right? It's like if that werewolf had been locked in the basement, coming up through the trap door, we could have gone full Sam Raimi with it. So, yeah, I think it's great. It harks back to so many different types of movies that aren't just werewolf movies, which I really liked. The one thing I will say, and I'm keen to see it a second time because I wonder whether it was the circumstances of how we watched it. Like you say, Chris, the screening room we were in, they left a light on for quite a lot of the film. I found it a bit visually murky, a bit uninteresting, and I don't know whether I don't know how you overcome this when you set a film across one night, so it's pretty much all set at night in the middle of the woods, so there's very little light, either sort of electrical light or natural light, and everything just looked quite dark and murky in not such an interesting way for me as well towards the end, which I thought was a bit of a shame. But I don't really know how you overcome that for a story like this.
It's a tricky one because I think it's really hard to judge, especially the first 45 minutes of the film, because that's when they turned the light off in the screening room. But I actually think that Leigh Whannell and his DP, Stefan Duccio, I probably pronounced that horribly wrong. I thought they played really, really nicely with the levels of dark and blackness in the film. There's some really, really nice manipulations. There's the moment towards the end where... Well, there's a couple of moments towards the end. There's a moment where we know that Blake is in the house because we've seen him in silhouette walking down the stairs.
Yes.
And Charlotte and Ginger can't see him. And they can't hear him because he's an animal and he knows how to hide in the shadows a little bit. But they know he's there.
Yeah.
And then there's that shot of Ginger and suddenly he's by her leg.
Oh, God, yeah.
And that's a great moment.
Great jump scare. Yeah.
And... I think they play with it. This is what it would be like in real life. I think they apply a real world perspective to it. If you are in a barn with a creature that can see in the dark, can hear your every heartbeat pretty much. And that's another great thing about that we get to see what he is experiencing. So we know how proficient he's going to be as a hunter.
Yep.
And how much he can see at night and how much he can hear at night. So when they're in the barn with him towards the end, you're thinking, oh my God, this is actually pretty gnarly.
Yeah.
Because he could be anywhere in this barn and he's literally right by them.
Yeah.
And they can't see him because he's managed to cloak himself in the shadows. That I thought was really, really terrific.
Absolutely. And those amazing kind of switches of POV where you get Christopher Abbott come down to the basement and you've got Charlotte trying to speak on the radio. And that's the moment when we hear that she's not making any sense. She's not speaking English, right? And suddenly there's this moment where you realize that communication has broken down between them. And I remember thinking at that moment, I was like, oh, it's quite brightly lit for a dark basement. But that's, of course, because we're seeing through his eyes where everything of his is heightened, right? And then does that beautiful thing where the camera pans round and it switches out of his point of view to hers. Suddenly she's speaking clear English and everything has gotten way, 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 way darker. And you can just see Christopher Abbott's sort of outline standing behind her, looking really menacing as well. And I was like, that's very clever. I did love that stuff where he kind of switched between the two points of view just to show how different these two had become and how they couldn't communicate anymore, you know?
Yeah, it was great. And there's also a really interesting scene where he's on the sofa, I think, and she has him write down what he thinks is happening, or and he writes down the word dying, and she says not dying. And I watched a clip of this. I think it was where I was watching a Chris Abbott interview on one of those dreadful US talk shows that you have to go on to promote these movies. And it was one of those morning ones. And they showed a clip from the movie, and they showed that clip. But in the clip for US TV, he writes changing, not dying. So they sanitized it even for an American morning audience.
Wow. That is interesting.
It's interesting.
Oh my God. Yeah, I'm keen to know how many changes got made at the last minute in this movie as well, because obviously it's a movie that did seem to have a bit of a troubled production history over the last few years, like what with Ryan Gosling and everything else, and post-COVID and everything else. Like, I wonder how many factors came into the end result. Not that it seems like a movie that is in any way kind of messy or compromised, actually. It's interesting to see, like what it's turned out to be compared to maybe what we were led to believe it was going to be, originally.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I know that there's an additional photography unit here who are cited in the credits, but otherwise, I don't really know. I mean, maybe we'll find out in a couple of years' time. Maybe they'll feel more open about being able to say what went down in this. But certainly, as we know from the production notes, Blake's mother's character just disappeared from the film, and even the sense that his mother, she was dying of ALS, and that's a thing as a kid that would be just horrifying to watch. You wouldn't really know what was happening to your mum. That's going to have a huge impact on Blake as an adult, and if that's gone from the movie, that's really interesting as well. So yeah, I'd love to know exactly how much got changed and what got changed and why. But I think where they've landed is a very solid, very, very good Wolfman movie.
It feels kind of quite timeless too, doesn't it? Invisible Man felt so much like a movie set and made in 2019. Like, it felt like such a modern, current, kind of pivotal movie in a way. Whereas this movie, it could almost be set anytime, couldn't it? I think not most because we've got that kind of rural, desolate setting as well, that like kind of natural setting. But yeah, there is something again that kind of feels quite timeless about it, which I quite like.
Yeah, and classic thing, isn't it? Of we're in the woods, we have no signal, so therefore we can't call for help.
Perfect.
Yeah.
It's all we need. It's all we need. Yeah. Well, there you go. Do you think this is it? Or are we going to get more Wolfman movies? Does it warrant a sequel, do you think? Would you like to see more movies set in this world?
I'd be intrigued. I think the movie, unless Charlotte was infected, I don't know necessarily that you could do a lot with this in terms of sequels. I guess you could have the lycanthropy being weaponized, right? So if Charlotte's a journalist, first of all, so we'd imagine that her first instinct is to protect her daughter and get her out of there the next day. But then also as a journalist, she'd probably be going, "This is a fucking great story," and I have proof. I have proof of it lying, outside the deer blind, and I have more proof lying on the kitchen floor of my husband's house.
Yes.
So maybe she opens it up to the world, and maybe that technology falls into the wrong hands, and you can have a weaponized werewolf situation, and then it makes it a little bit more of a sort of amalgamation of the technology of the Invisible Man and the groundedness of Wolfman.
Yeah,
I don't know, but it's interesting because you do get the sense that it's opening this week out, so we don't know how it's going to do in the States or over here. It's a January movie, and that tends to be, there's a perception that movies that open in January, unless they're Oscar movies, are being dumped in some way.
Yeah.
You could also, I don't know, you could also look at the fact that they released the major transformation sequence as a clip recently. So maybe there's a genuine worry that this movie might not connect or might not do that well.
Yeah.
And I do wonder how scary it is once you get to the last 20 minutes or so. Or maybe I'm just completely wrong, and maybe not everyone is as optimistic as I am about Blake's intentions, and maybe everyone's going to be on tenterhooks for the last 20 or so.
I think you're right. I think the last 20 minutes or so lack a bite, right, for want of a better word. But for me, the first hour and 15 were so strong and were really scary that I think ultimately I came out still finding it's I said this to Universal, I think it's probably the best and most effective werewolf movie in at least the last 20 years for me. I mean, there hasn't been a huge amount of competition, to be fair. I mean, the last big werewolf movie I can remember is Ginger Snaps. That was 2001. Before that, Dog Soldiers. So, it has been a while. But I do think, for a subgenre that is not particularly successful a lot of the time, Leigh Whannell has pulled off something really interesting. But I agree with you. I think I've got a feeling it's not going to be as commercially successful or as much of a crowd pleaser as The Invisible Man was, for sure.
Yeah, watch it make $100 million in the summer weekend now. I don't know. There's been some really good ones recently. Werewolves Within was a cracker.
That was fun. Yeah.
There is a film called Werewolves, which apparently is really good, coming out in February. I haven't seen it yet, so I'm looking forward to that. And who could forget the Benicio del Toro? Rick Baker.
Yeah.
Wolfman.
Well, this is it. We're in quite a good era after the kind of very failed attempt, right, at launching a kind of dark universe a few years ago. I think we're in a really interesting time just for sort of one-off monster movies at the moment. Obviously, Robert Eggers' Nosferatu is still doing really well right now. We're getting a Guillermo del Toro Frankenstein, I think, later this year, right? I believe next year, 2026, is slated. We're getting a Lee Cronin's The Mummy made by Blumhouse as well.
Yes.
So I am liking this new take on these monster movies. I think they're giving them to interesting filmmakers who kind of know what to do with them, right?
Yeah, very much so. Lee Cronin's The Mummy is very, very exciting.
Because
very,
he knows what he's doing, Lee Cronin, right? He's a good
he
horror
knows what
filmmaker.
he's doing.
Yeah.
I'm slightly disappointed he's not doing the next Evil Dead movie, but
yeah,
do something new. Why not? Why the hell not? And I'm fascinated to see whatever Leigh Whannell does next, because I think even though this isn't as good as Invisible Man for me, I think he's got some serious chops.
Yeah. 100%. I can't wait to see what he does next. There you go. Well, Chris, thank you so much for joining me to discuss this movie. I've loved it. And if people want to hear more Wolfman chat, by the sounds of it, you've got a big, long interview coming up on Empire, right, with these guys?
Yeah, which is available to our Spoiler Special subscribers. So if you want to join the ranks, you can do so. It's empire.supportingcast.fm. It's £3.49 a month, and you get loads of Spoiler Specials. You get access to our sort of vault of spoiler specials, over 400 over the years, most of which have incredible interviews with filmmakers, and the one or two even has Mike on them. So there you go. I continued the evolution of horror,
because I interviewed Leigh Whannell too for this movie, which people will have heard if they're listening to this, because I'll put it on the episode first. But bless him, he was all over the shop. I don't know if he was for you, Chris, but obviously the LA fires were going on. I think he was a bit freaked out. It was very sweet of him to still do the interview, but he had no Wi-Fi. He was using 5G, and at one point he was crouched on the floor of his bathroom talking to me, and I was like, I feel like we're in like a Saw movie together. Like I'm just looking at Leigh Whannell crouched on a bathroom floor talking to me. Like, bless him, lovely man though.
Yeah, same thing here. He turned his camera off for me so he could preserve his battery life a little bit more. So I didn't get to see whether he was on his bathroom floor or not. But I said to him, we can do this another time. Yeah. It's not, we don't have to do this now. But and his power had gone out and everything. It was. Yeah, it's crazy. I hope he's all right. I hope his family are okay and his house is intact.
Yeah,
it's a crazy time.
Crazy time indeed. Well, Chris Hewitt, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Mike. Always a pleasure.
And there we go. That's it for our Wolfman special. Thank you all so much for listening. One more time, a huge thank you to my brilliant guest, Chris Hewitt, and a big thanks to the wonderful Leigh Whannell. Hope Leigh and his family are keeping safe, and just sending all my thoughts and good wishes to all of our listeners in Los Angeles. I hope you are all doing okay. And we are all thinking of you and sending all the love and best wishes. So I would love to hear what you guys thought of Wolfman when you get a chance to see it. Please do get in touch. Let us know what you thought. Did you enjoy this film as much as Chris and I? How did it compare to The Invisible Man and other Leigh Whannell films, in your opinion? And how does it compare to other great werewolf movies? I would love to hear your thoughts. Please do get in touch. Thank you all so much for listening. We'll be back on Friday for another regular episode of The Evolution of Horror.